Howdy, folks. Today's episode is a journey back in time to the golden age of Hollywood, where glamour, light, and legendary portraits ruled the silver screen. We're diving into the world of classic Hollywood photography and the incredibly artistry of George Hurrell. If you love timeless portraiture and cinematic style, you're in for a real treat just after this. Welcome to Camera Shake, the show bringing you the insider scoop on everything photography and videography, giving you the edge you need to stay inspired and ahead of the game. I'm your host, Kirsten Nutz, and before we jump in, just a quick favor, over 65% of our YouTube viewers and podcast listeners are not actually subscribed to this channel. Come on, you can help me fix that. Hit that subscribe button. It only takes a second and helps me keep bringing amazing guests your way. Thanks a million for your support. All right, buckle up because today's guest is a historian, author, photographer, and one of the foremost experts on Hollywood's visual legacy. He's written the definitive book on George Hurrell and continues to keep the glamour of the golden age alive. Please welcome the brilliant Mr. Mark Vieira. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kirsten. I'm glad to be here.
It's going to be an amazing conversation. And just to bring our viewers up to date, we're having a little problem with the video feed. So what we're going to do is we're going to throw in loads and loads and loads of images throughout the whole show. So nothing's going to change for our audio listeners over on the podcast platforms. But if you're watching on YouTube in particular, then stay in your seat because you're going to get an amazing insight into the world of the golden age of Hollywood. Mark, it's an absolute pleasure having you on the show. This topic in itself is something that's interested me ever since I was a child. What inspired you, let me say, to first start writing about photographers like George Hurrell in the first place?
Well, in a way, it was like what you were describing, seeing your grandmother's work, or photography work, and seeing that it had a different quality to it. For me, this happened in 1958 when I was about 8, seeing movies on TV that were appearing suddenly from the studio. The Hollywood studios were selling or leasing their pre-1948 libraries of films. And I say 1948 because they didn't want to pay residuals to the actors in the films, so they used that as a cutoff point. So films made between roughly 1929 and 48 were everywhere. The morning movie, the afternoon movie, the late show, the late show. And this is on local TV as opposed to networks. And they would arrive at the TV stations in 16 millimeter prints, and the TV stations would cut them to fit time slots and usually cut chunks and chunks of them out. And of course, there had to be commercials every 10 minutes. So, but I did see these movies that looked like nothing in 1958 because the cultural landscape had changed dramatically since the 30s. And the big thing about seeing these movies was that I wanted to go research them at the local public library. And there I found some books, not many, unfortunately, because there weren't many, the history of the movies, like the pictorial history of the talkies by Daniel Blum. And so they had lots of pictures in them. And that's what I was gravitating to, the imagery that I saw, because it looked so different. And we'll get to that eventually, why it looked different. But I was just fascinated by these movies. So I made student films in grammar school and high school. Went to film school at USC. That's at University of Southern California, the cinema school there. Pretty much in an effort to emulate what I had seen in these classic films. And in high school, I was lucky to have the school that allowed me to rent 16 millimeter prints of these movies. So I was able to study them, more closely than I could by seeing them on TV. I learned how to make frame enlargements from the images in the films and, print them in a darkroom. I started it in a darkroom when I was 19 in October 69 at Cal State Hayward. And I got a work study job. So I was a paid photographer when I was 19 doing darkroom work. and taking pictures on campus for the audiovisual department. They had various needs. In any case, my fascination with this era hit a new level when I was in college, and a fellow student showed me these fan magazines from the early 30s. I knew they existed, but I didn't realize how prominent they had been and how influential. And there were these portraits of stars whom I knew and revered and loved. In fact, I had written to. I wrote to Greta Garbo. I wrote to Norma Shearer. Nobody answered, unfortunately. Um, but I saw under the photographs, it said photographed by Hurell or photographed by Clarence Sinclair Bull. Now, there had been a book out from Clarence Bull, I guess in around 68. It was called Faces of Hollywood. And it was he told his story in there about being the head of the MGM still department. He, he omitted any mention of George Hurrell because they didn't have a happy relationship. But so, but I was acquainted with Bull, but not with Hurrell, curiously enough. The only mention of him in a book up to that time had been in 1959 in Joan Crawford's autobiography, Portrait of Joan. She mentioned Hurrell, and there was illustrations in there, and she credited him in every one of them because she felt that he had been instrumental in making her a star and sustaining her stardom. So, when I saw these fan magazines, the next thing, of course, was that my friend had original prints, and these were, to use the parlance of the time, mind-blowing. Because, I was shooting with 35 millimeter and printing on 8 by 10 on poly contrast Kodak paper, but I'd never seen anything like these prints. The clarity, the tonal scale, the imagery itself just was really phenomenal. And so I just wanted to know all about this. And I was working part-time at the audiovisual department at USC at the School of Dentistry, where they had a beautiful studio and a large darkroom. And even though my job there was to push cards to different classrooms for teachers to use, projectors and so forth, I was spending a lot of time in that photo studio, and this led to a full-time job. So at the same time that I was learning about large format photography at this job, being able to use film and paper at will, in lieu of raises, salary raises, um, I I tried to get in touch with Hurrell, and I had gone to MGM and met the head of the stills department there. And of course, if you were a USC student, that had a certain sheen to it, importance to it. So I was able to get in certain places, but when I called Hurrell, he was just not interested in talking to me at all. But then a year later, in the fall of 1975, uh, I was able to meet him because it transpired that he was doing a book of his work to, I guess, to to knock Clarence Bull's book off the racks, and needed images that he did not have in his own collection because he had not retained very many of his photographs or negatives. But MGM, this man at MGM, Dory Freeman, the head of the stills department, and coincidentally, Joan Crawford's greatest living fan, had a house full in West Hollywood, a house full of original MGM stills. So my job was to shoot copy negatives at USC Dental School and then, deliver them to George Hurrell in North Hollywood. And my qualifications were that my boss, Michael Abbey, had taught me how to shoot a copy negative from a black and white photograph and using the special film called Kodak Pro Copy 4125 4x5 sheet film, and then to process it in HC 110 dilution E, not A, not B, E, to get the longest tonal scale and to keep the grain down. So I was doing some very impressive copy prints, at age 24, at 25, and so the skill was exactly what was needed by George Hurrell at that time. So I was allowed to, you know, socialize with him to a certain limited extent. But ultimately, he made friends with John Cobell, the London-based, uh, what would you call him? He was an archivist, a collector, a writer, a journalist, and a personality in London at that time. Uh, he had a tremendous collection, and so Hurell got more material from him that really and was a better quality too than a copy print. Better to get the original negative or to get a vintage print than to because Dory Freeman, no collector was going to let anything out the front door. That was just a fact. So Hurell did much better with Cobell because Cobell wanted his cooperation and collaboration on his own projects because he had his eyes on the stars too. So this is how it all came to be. Now, as far as books, at that time I didn't have a thought of writing a book. I had no context for that, and I had no experience. Um, but that came in the late '80s when I was looking for a job in San Francisco, and went to Media Alliance, and they had these binders with job listings in them. This is you must think that's very primitive because now, who you wouldn't see a piece of paper within miles. But here are these binders, and one listing was for American Graphic Systems looking for photography collections or writers to write captions and text for they were called instant remainders, uh, bargain books. They were books that were done by big companies, but done at a discounted price, and they'd be on a certain table as you walked into the bookstore. So there'd be great trains of the American Northwest or exciting discoveries from space travel. And this company would get free pictures from some government agency and then hire a writer and pay them some crappy little fee to write this text. But here I came to them with my photo collection, with it that time, was looking pretty good. And my purported skill as a writer. So, they saw me coming, to put it bluntly. So but this enabled me, doing this book enabled me to mount a promotion in the San Francisco Bay Area for my own portrait work. And it worked. I got coverage at all the major media, TV stations, newspapers, magazines, everything. And it really was a boost to me. But, at the back of it all was this book called Hollywood Portraits, which wasn't really portraits. It was scene stills, behind the scene stills, and portraits, in which I told stories that I had heard from George Hurrell and Clarence Bull and Lazo Willinger and the rest of them at that, up to that time. All the veterans whom I had sought and interviewed and shown my work to and printed for, as in the case of Willinger and Hurell. And so I was able to share my knowledge, and so there were 2 books, like that, 2 instant remainder books that I did for that company, and they did extremely well. I had no agent, so there was no back end royalties. So,
Perfect.
90,000 books later, my wallet was empty, but they did quite well. But, the books did lead to more books later because they showed that I could do something, that I had content and I had style too.
It's a really interesting story because it's for me, it's almost like everything's coming full circle because you know, I grew up with well, in a family of photographers. My grandmother was a photographer and my dad was a photographer. And one of the earliest memories that I have, um, as a child was a book that my dad had on a coffee table, it was around the house, and it was Clarence Sinclair Bull's book, and I remember as a kid looking at it, being totally fascinated by these sort of amazing black and white, you know, Hollywood headshots, essentially. Um, and and that's really sort of to me, I think that experience made me a portrait photographer in the end, as opposed to, I don't know, a wildlife photographer, a product photographer, whatever. But that really sort of instilled my fascination of um, of portraiture, and it was the lighting and the precision and just the whole look. And the other thing that fascinated me back then was, I was used to seeing old prints that my grandma had made back in the late 30s and throughout the 40s, and the 50s. And when you see prints of that age, of course, they would have faded, they would have aged, and you know, and to see those prints in a book in the way that they would have been, originally, it was really quite, it was mesmerizing. I think is the best way to describe it. And which is why, I was uh, I was really thrilled when I saw your book, George Hurrell's Hollywood, which is a fantastic. It's like a time machine, actually. That's how I would describe it. It's a fantastic book. It has all the stories in it, amazing imagery, and most fascinatingly, a lot of the behind the scenes um, imagery that gives you a real. I don't know. It allows you to step into that time a little bit, and get an understanding of how these images were created at the time. Um, and of course, that close relationship of photographer, studio, and star at the time. Um, but before we get into the whole studio situation at the time, um, for you as a photographer and somebody who is, an expert on that golden era portraiture, we often call these images timeless. What defines a timeless portrait for you?
Well, for me, it would be to look at a picture and to say to myself, I don't know when this was taken. So that would be that the styling, the makeup, hairstyle would be not so linked to a particular. I mean, I used to joke in the late '70s about these young women who had blush on their cheeks in a certain way. It was popular for a while. But so in other words, that would nail a picture as being 1979 or something. But I mean, if a picture that didn't have anything like that in it, but also were the technical, the lighting, the posing, uh, were sufficiently unobtrusive and of a whole as to not call attention to themselves. So that to me would be a timeless, where both form and content were not uh, linked to a particular time.
Hey, let me just jump in real quick to tell you about the amazing sponsor of this episode, Platypod. Platypod offers innovative camera support systems designed to unleash your creativity. With their stable, versatile, and portable solutions, you can capture stunning shots like never before. And I'm not just saying that. As the host of the Camera Shake podcast, I can personally vouch for Platypod's incredible products. They've become an integral part of the show. In fact, I'm surrounded by various Platypod products holding up lights, cameras, microphones, and so on. It's really helped to transform the way I make the show and the way I shoot at home, in the studio, and on location. But don't just take my word for it. Explore Platypod's website at www.platypod.com to discover their range of products, including the Platypod Extreme, Platypod tripod heads, and the brand new handle, of course. Make sure to follow Platypod on Instagram and Facebook at Platypod Tripods for exclusive updates, tips, and giveaways. By choosing Platypod, you're not only investing in your photography, but you're also supporting the Camera Shake Photography Podcast. Thanks again to Platypod, our amazing sponsor. Platypod, where innovation never sleeps. What's interesting about George Hurrell's work in particular is the sort of evolution in the lighting. Um, how what, how did George Hurrell light these portraits? What was his special sauce, like his secret ingredient that made his work stand out from the rest?
Yeah, as it evolved, he seemed to have, and he never expressed this in words. He seemed to have an innate understanding of light itself, as seen, uh, light coming through a forest, leaves, noontime light on top of a head as opposed to sunset light. how to combine the effects of both of those in a portrait. Um, and so when he started at MGM, he suddenly had, he had been independent before that and had some very primitive kinds of little homemade lights. But when he got to MGM, they had just perfected the Fresnel spotlight, focusing light, and they had big soft lights with two big bulbs inside of a big curved metal, what you call it, housing that reflect there was reflection inside of it, and you put silk in front of it and a beautiful milky kind of quality to it. Um, so and he still was not satisfied. He wanted the lights to be more mobile, more free flying. So he got them to create something based on a microphone boom, only it was a boom for a light. And he foolishly did not patent that. If he had, he would have been wealthy on that alone because within a year or 2 years, every studio had copied that idea. Every studio had a boom light. Every sound stage had boom lights on it for motion picture work. But, he never thought ahead. He never took it seriously. Uh, but he just was an impulsive and immediate person. So as the artistic impulse struck him, he would follow it. But he wasn't, given to contemplation, pondering, introspection, anything like that.
And I know George Hurrell was originally a painter, or at least that was his intention originally. And I think he fell into photography more or less by accident. Do you think his fascination with light can be sort of traced back to his ambitions as a painter?
No question that he definitely, yeah, was fascinated by especially top light hitting like a young woman's head and shoulder. This is a signature thing. A very strong top light bouncing up from below back into her eyes. So you get this kind of liquid quality to the eyes that you wouldn't get from a regular key fill setup. Um, and now I have seen his paintings, and I just couldn't understand. They didn't seem to have any quality of light in them, such as you'd see in Rembrandt or Turner or Caravaggio. They didn't have that. Where his photography shoo, had nothing but it was just all an abstraction of light. Um, so, a man who was impossible to figure out, and you couldn't ask him questions like that. He just was not going to answer them.
It's super interesting. I mean, a lot of the things that he pioneered, a lot of the techniques he pioneered are now really standard techniques in portrait
Well,
photography.
yeah, exactly. Everything looks so different in 1933 than it did in 1930, and it was because of him. I mean, everybody was copying him. Clarence Bull, his boss, uh, Harvey White, people at Eugene Robert Ritchie. I mean, everybody at the other studios, everybody was copying him, to moving away from soft focus and broad light sources to spotlights, because he's really made spotlights the thing. Now, the one reason why they couldn't do that before was because the retouching was an issue. If you used a soft light as a source and a soft focus lens or a diffusion disc on in front of a hard lens, a commercial lens, to get a real soft, creamy halos and everything, um, you had less retouching to do for the skin. But with a spotlight shooting across a person's skin, you had to have very precise retouching, and luckily, what happened at the same time was this Adams retouching machine. I don't know exactly what year it came in, but the point is, it he had there was this room of people retouching negatives at MGM, and he told them what effects he wanted, and they would do them, but the thing is they could do it very precisely with this retouching machine, and, that wasn't possible before, or let's put it this way, they weren't gonna spend the time to do it before. I mean, I've done it by hand. I don't have a retouching machine, and since I learned how to do this 50 years ago. I've done it just with a pencil and a negative, but the you'll see the difference it makes on a very sharp image is tremendous.
It
You start at the hairline and you go down to the chest, and you just do every single pore, pimple, crevice, stress line, freckle, everything. You do the in the cornea, you take out the little veins.
and we see an example of that on the screen right now. For those of you, watching on YouTube, um, it's one of these. It's one of these kind of pet peeves I think that I have. When people often say like, "Oh, well, it looks very photoshopped," and I immediately think, well, but it's not a new retouching is not a new phenomenon. It's it just used to be done in the dark room before the
No,
advent of
not
Photoshop.
the dark room. No, not the dark
Oh,
room.
not the dark room, yeah.
No, no, it was done. You could sit at a table with a light box
Yeah.
and just do it there. Now, uh, I should add, it's important. Before they applied the pencil to the negative, they would rub mucilage, was they called it something dope. They call it dope.
Right.
Uh, onto this with a cotton ball. Put this cotton ball on top of the bottle and shake it, and then you rub this thing on with a circular motion, starting in the center of the negative, going out, 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 out till the whole negative's covered, supposedly. And then you could retouch on it, and when the pencil hit the emulsion, that's where you retouch, not the base. It would that what line you just made is not going to come off. Now I had a terrible experience in 1989 because the film also had a tooth that is, what would you call that? A rough surface that would hold the lead.
Mhm.
So you didn't necessarily need the mucilage, but it made it much more precise. All right, so Kodak changed its manufacture of Vericolor, I think it was Vericolor 3 in 1989, and suddenly there was no tooth. So I retouched the whole negative, and to my horror, the retouching blew off.
Oh, wow.
So I had to, go to the stores and what the hell? And they said that, well, you've got to have retouching fluid. So I had to retouch the whole negative over again. But I did like the mucilage, the fluid, because I was able to get more precise strokes from my pencil tip. I used architect's lead.
It's
Now,
amazing. The whole process is fascinating to me. I mean, I'm so used to electronic forms of retouching.
well,
That
I'm curious. Then, is you just use a program and you just tell it what to do and then it does it, or do you go on there and do it yourself?
So I like to be a little bit more manual. So I retouch in Photoshop normally, and there's a lot of. I mean, there are lots of AI powered programs that you can use to do things like standard things like skin retouching, hair retouching, all that kind of stuff. Eyes, teeth, lips, that sort of thing. Um, but I find that I like to have more control, and I also enjoy the process. That's the other thing. I actually enjoy the process. So I'm not necessarily personally that interested in taking that whole process out of my workflow. I mean, yeah, if I have a quick delivery and things have to be fast, and it's not a particularly like well paid job. Okay, fair enough. But I quite enjoy the retouching process. So and,
You know, Ted Allen, who was probably the greatest retoucher in the history of Hollywood, said to me one day, he says, you have to be in the mood to do this.
yeah,
Because
absolutely.
you figure if it's a head as large as the one in this picture of Joan Crawford, that's going to be at least 4 hours, and it could be more because those negatives are huge, and you're doing it pore by pore. Now, on the retouching I do now on digital, I try to get the effect as close as possible to the effect I was getting with the pencil. So I use the dodge tool, very small and like a 6%, and do the retouching the same way, starting at the forehead and just doing anything that's dark, I lighten to match the area next to it, and just work my way down until I get an overall tone, and then I go back and do more to smooth it out and get the soft gradations from light to shadow and vice versa. Um, and once in a while, I have to use the clone tool to take something like the big lines in her neck. That might be a good job for the clone tool to easier than going in there with the dodge tool. But no, I try to keep it and I I have been very happy that I've gotten effects very close to the old fashioned retouching with digital. Where it looks least because the your goal is, and Hurell was very specific about this, uh, to give the skin a quality that even though it's retouched, it still looks like skin. It must not look like it's been airbrushed into a kind of a dullness or smoothed out so it looks like an inflatable plastic toy. It has to look like skin. And that's one of the things about that technique with the pencil. You're making these kind of figure eight things that mimic pore structure. So it does look like skin. Has the same luminosity. In other words, the idea that light is shining into the skin and then coming out again. And that's the reason for using this particular technique, where he insisted that the subjects not wear makeup base because he wanted that skin to look like skin. Now there were two subjects he had who got tired of. They said, "Oh no, I want to look a certain way, closer to how I look on the movie screen." So that was Norma Shearer and Jean Harlow. Both insisted on wearing this very white makeup, and he dealt with it. And those, frankly, those pictures are no less effective for their wearing makeup. But it's not the same effect that you get with a Crawford portrait, where you can. It's like alabaster, the skin, but still it's skin.
It's interesting to see the sort of progression of retouching, from the early, like I said, the late 20s, early 30s onwards uh, throughout the decade. Because I think the attention to detail just got more and more advanced. It's a little bit like when you first start out with something like Photoshop or frequency separation or techniques like that. When you first get into that, you tend to go way over the top, and you look at the image, and all of a sudden it looks like a plastic doll mannequin type of a thing. Um, it's just that ability to scale that back to the point where it looks natural is something I think that requires expertise and experience over time.
Well, you're very right. And one of the important rules is narrative to change the basic contour of the face, because then it's no longer the same person.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's exactly, and that's the thing. It's you know, I think it's very easy to take all the detail out because you think like, oh well, I can smooth this out, and I can make that more homogeneous as far as skin tone is concerned. But then when you zoom out and you look at the thing as a whole, the whole face, you very quickly go, oh wait, I've gone completely over the top. And the problem with that is, well, the problem generally in Photoshop is that of course you can zoom in as much as you want. The problem is when you start zooming out and you're seeing, a wider view of it, that you first notice that you've actually gone, you've way overshot. I remember in the beginning, there were many occasions where I either had to go back and start again, and just start whole retouch again, or where I looked at the image several weeks or months later, and with the benefit of time, realized that I'd completely overshot the goal. But, it's a learning experience. But that's where the fun is, I think, with retouching just in general.
Yeah, and I mean, for example, you'll see some Hollywood portraits from the period or scene stills where an overzealous retoucher has gotten the lower eyelid off somebody like Dietrich, who really needed her lower eyelids because to make her face the magical thing that it was. And they took her lower eyelids out. You got this weird smooth thing from her eyelashes down to her cheekbone, and she doesn't look like herself anymore.
Yeah,
But you don't see that very often.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, what was George Hurrell's relationship like with the stars?
Very formal. There was a caste system, and you know, for example, he met his wife at a party held by director Frank Borzage, who was, a major box office earner, big important films, but he still was kind of a maverick. So it wasn't like the party would have a studio head or a big star at it. Frank Borzage had a lot of artistic people at his parties, so he invited George Hurrell, and George Hurrell met his wife there, his future wife. Um, but you didn't see George Hurrell invited to a party at Louis B. Mayer's home or Irving Thalberg's home. I don't think that Hurrell ever went to the home of Irving Thalberg and Norma Shearer, even though she was his patron and she owed a lot to him. And also Joan Crawford, he was not invited to parties there. And indeed, all the times he had photographed there, he had to stay downstairs. He couldn't go into the living quarters.
Because he had a almost like I would say in working terms, an intimate relationship with Norma Shearer. He photographed her for quite a long time.
Yeah, it was from 29 to 36. The last thing they did together was the Romeo and Juliet. But I remember him saying to me, "Oh, that was so big, everybody was on it. Ted Allen and Clarence Bull and everybody they was on that." Um, but yeah, what he liked about her was that she'd come to him with a concept for a session, whether it was based on a film she'd just done or just some clothes she had bought. She wanted to do a concept to create a different personality. And whereas Crawford was just anything that would just happen, they would zoom through it. Carol Lombard would storyboard her sessions. I believe this is true. Uh, Dietrich insisted on having a full length mirror next to the camera so she could see how she was posing. So there were all different ways of working with the people, but he did owe a lot to Shearer because she got him into MGM, and when he quit impulsively, she saved his job for him because he was going to be, without a question, blackballed because Louis B. Mayer could do that. It happened to movie stars, technicians, you name it. If you went on the wrong side of Mayer, you never worked again in Hollywood because these people, had Sunday brunches together. These executives on Thursday nights there were the card games at, Sam Goldwyn's house, and they exchanged stories there about who was in, who was out. So it was, you had to behave, and you couldn't assert yourself against these people, or it's over. I mean, there are all kinds of photographers who came and went at MGM, Harvey White, Stephen McNulty, Ted Allen, and who they may have worked again at CBS in New York or in Hollywood. They never worked in the studio system again.
What was George Hurrell like as a personality when you met him? And back in the sort of heydays of Hollywood, was he an amenable kind of person?
No, he was fiery, temperamental, um, hard to know, hard to understand, why he would change. His moods would change so violently. Um, he was a real artist. I mean, just the quote unquote artistic temperament, he had it in spades. And I think, like Greta Garbo, neither of them understood what this talent meant, what this gift meant, uh, that they were not happy with the demands it made upon them as people. And, they wanted privacy and they couldn't get it because they had this gift that everybody wanted to some part of. So he was very much that way. He liked answering technical questions, and Clarence Bull especially liked that because it meant that I understood something about their work that nobody else did. I said to Laszlo Willinger, I said, "Well, and I'd rather be asking you a question about where you put your fill light and if you have a snoot on it than how it was to work with Clark Gable." I said, "I'm sure people asking you that all the time." And he said, "Well, you can ask me that too if you want." He said he was as much fun in the gallery as he was on the screen. But, but they did appreciate that I wanted to learn and I wanted to carry on this tradition. Because, in 1974, 75, it was 35 millimeter or nothing. And it was strobes. Nobody used incandescent lights to light a portrait. I mean, it was just unheard of. And, ever since then, it's been more and more so. I mean, there have been, yes, people who say, okay, I'm going to use that old style. But every person who came to me and said, "Oh, can you show me how to do it? Or can you show me how to do it? Tell me what you learned from Hurell and from Bull and from Ted Allen and Leslie Willinger." I said, "Okay, let's start out with the spotlight here." Spotlight. I have a strobes. I said, "But you have to use spotlight." But you can't do it with strobe? No, no, you've got to use the spotlight. Oh. Okay, now let's sit down and do some retouching. Okay, so here's let's start at the forehead now, and we're working our way down. And you see what I'm doing? Mm-hmm. Okay, you see what I'm doing? Let's look at it. Let's do a test print and see what we got. Okay, but it's been an hour and you only got down to the eyebrows. I said, yeah. Oh, and this is how it went every time. People, they did not want to shoot large format. They did not want to use incandescent lights, and they did not want to spend 2, 4, 6 hours on a negative. They just didn't. So bye.
I mean, what is the advantage of using incandescent light over over strobes other than
Oh, because it's much more easy to control. It's precise. It really does. It has a warmth to the skin tones because it's yellow, so it complements the skin tones. Light from a strobe is bluish like sunlight, and I mean the only thing to me worse would be doing a portrait under fluorescent lights where people are green. But uh, the whole advantage of all this, what is your ultimate goal? How much better can I make a person look with this technique than I can with any other technique? And 1000% really. You can really transform a human being with this technique. Now, mind you, since digital, there are ways to get to that same destination without using an incandescent light or negative retouching or whatever. But uh, even in my digital portraits using this technique, there still is a great difference in the feeling, in the subjective effect that these images have when you look at them than there would be if I was shooting with a big umbrella light like Scavullo or Scribnesky or somebody.
one of the things that has sort of happened over the last maybe 5 years or something is the sort of emergence of LED technology, where I know in my circle of portrait photography, portrait photographer friends, um, I've noticed a number of people moving away from strobes now that there's LED technology that allows that allows certain that allows you to do certain things that you couldn't do before. Um, do you see that as a replacement for old tungsten lights when it comes to this particular style of photography?
Well, I wish I could look at a picture that was shot with that and then compare it. Um, I know I don't like LED on a flashlight. Does that say anything? I don't like LED when I screw it into a light bulb because it's supposed to be better for the environment. There's just a quality that you get from a filament glowing inside of a bulb that you're not going to get any other way. Uh, and it's as I say, if your goal is to make people look as good as you can, uh, there's something we haven't discussed yet, and that is something you mentioned it in your questions to me earlier. Uh, how does this relate to a person who maybe doesn't have this technology or doesn't want to do this exactly, but what can this person, an aspiring photographer or a working professional, learn from this? And that is something very important that Hurell would then agree with, and Clarence Bull and everybody. there are basic rules of portraiture that you must observe, and these come from the days of the old masters painting portraits, but they essentially come from what human beings are. I guess the expression is hardwired. Uh, there's one sun in the sky. Okay, so you see one shadow under your eyelids, one shadow under your nose, one shadow under your chin. If you put two lights on the same person at the same level, like two key lights, well, there aren't two suns in the sky, so immediately it's going to look weird. And people still do that. They put the fill light up at the same level as the key light, and I just want to hit them over the head and say, "No, no, this is forbidden." Uh, and essentially, what you're doing is you're working with what human beings are used to seeing uh, in a situation or in a room where there's a light bulb on a ceiling or a soft light on a ceiling. I mean, the physiognomy looks most natural on a person when you're seeing shadows falling downward. Now, there are the exceptions of the romantic portraits where they're lit from straight on or below or whatever. And Hurell did a lot of that, and so did Clarence Bull. And movies close-ups too weren't all lit with a key light, fill light, and backlight. Sometimes the key light was lowered, and they use a spot with a snoot on it to get a certain effect. But the point is, that still is mimicking the effect that you would get if somebody was in a courtyard, let's say, with the light coming from above, from behind them, and light bouncing up to them from the stones, the flagstones, or a wall in front of them, or wherever. But these are basic things that you don't want to change physiognomy. You want to observe the basic rules of portraiture so the face still looks like a face. But and the other thing too is, well, every face is different. So what is the rule for where you put your light? And this, of course, Hurell was this was his this was his genius. It wasn't just the lighting. It was that he invariably chose the right angle for a person's face based on eye size, relation of eyes to nose and mouth, the forehead size, the chin, all that. He knew how to position a person so that would uh, he would observe that. Now, these are basic things that should be taught, and I suppose are taught in photography schools for basic portraiture.
You mentioned Clarence Sinclair Bull, and I know that both Hurell and Bull used to literally work in the same building, but they didn't exactly get on terribly well.
Well, Clarence Bull thought that okay, let me backtrack a bit. In the 20s at MGM, there was a woman photographer named Ruth Harriet Louise, and she was doing the portraiture, and Clarence Bull was managing the entire still photography department and doing portraits. And he was really gifted. He was great. Um, so he thought that when she left in December 1929, that he would move to her position, become the head portrait photographer. But then this thing happened where Norma Shearer brought in Hurell because she was so thrilled with what he had done for her at his little studio in the building where I now have my studio. She insisted that he become, head portrait photographer. So Clarence Bull resented that. And then Hurell was not a friendly person. And Bull was a very reserved person. So the two just they could never meet in any common ground. And also Hurell insisted that his negatives be processed by nobody else. I mean, this laboratory was fantastic. The tolerances were so fine. It was just he did great work. No, wasn't good. He had to process his own negatives. So that meant that his negatives would not be stamped with the flash, like it was a flashing device that put the date of the negative, the photographer, what production it was to be charged to, and what number exposure this was. It was a machine that Clarence Bull had invented. And so Hurell's negatives never had this edge marking on them. So you can't tell the date. I mean, for example, I know that Greta Garbo was photographed November 19th, 1931 by Clarence Bull for Matahari, but who knows what day Norma Shearer was photographed in 1932 by Hurell for Smiling Through. So anyway, there was all these things that Hurell just was difficult. He was no other way to describe it. Just uh, perverse.
He was a team player.
No, he wasn't. And when he left in July 32, they brought in various people, Russell Ball, Harvey White, Stephen McNulty, Ted Allen, a whole slew of them, but ultimately had to let him come back little by little um, for the next 5 years because the stars just insisted on having him. And then finally, when Irving Thalberg died in September 36, Mayer then just overruled everybody else and said, no more Hurell. Just they brought somebody in, Laszlo Willinger from Europe, and he did the work. But still, Clarence Bull was doing a lot of the work, and he was doing great work. But he still had to manage everything else, so he didn't have time to do everybody.
Um, how much influence did the studios have over like how their stars were being portrayed? Was it left completely to the photographers, or were there specific rules or guidelines that they had to follow? How much
Yes,
freedom
there
did they
were.
have?
You're right. There were guidelines. Well, from a very simple thing like the newspapers want to use little inserts at the top of reviews for the latest movie of a star, and when they don't want light, they don't, I'm sorry, they don't want dark backgrounds. They want light backgrounds. Hurell refused to shoot light backgrounds. Not every session. I mean, there's plenty of pictures by Hurell with light background, but he would just get on a tear where he would just shoot everything dark just to vex them. And they want Clark Gable to be shot in kind of sporty, outdoorsy kind of poses with a polo riding outfit and all this because he's kind of a lounge lizard in reality with an older wife. But we want to make him, the young women are mad for him. So we want to show them, oh, here's this He-Man guy. He's really, out there. And I mean, he did enjoy shooting and all that kind of stuff and riding his motorcycle at 100 miles an hour, but he wasn't, out there playing polo with the British colony of Hollywood. But they portrayed him that way. So that yeah, there were plenty of uh, plenty of ways in which Hurell and Bull were told, we're trying to sell the image of this person as such. So you're not gonna, they were not gonna show certain actresses vampy, and they were not gonna show certain actors being spiritual. It just depended on the kind of character that they had portrayed in films and who they were supposed to be.
How easy or difficult was it for photographers at the time, especially Hurrell, to sort of translate their style of shooting to an outdoors location? Was he entirely studio bound at the time, or was there a way to create uh, his sort of
Oh, that's a
signature
good
style?
question. Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah. He would, he did adapt quite readily because he loved being outdoors, fishing and painting especially. He loved painting outdoors. What's it called? Plein air. And he, so of course he was happy, uh, photographing Norma Shearer with the blossoms in a apricot orchard in Pasadena where they were filming Strange Interlude. He went there to the location and shot a whole session of her there with the apricot trees, the blossoms. Um, but they would use pretty much reflectors as opposed to having to bring a generator and plug lights in. They liked those big silver reflectors, and they had a very pleasing light to them.
So we talked about Clarence Sinclair Bull and George Hurrell. Are there any other lesser known photographers of the time that you think should or deserve maybe more of a mention?
Yes, and they're not lesser known at auction houses.
Hmm.
They're okay. For example, Clarence Bull, his stuff is great and it gets good prices. Um, Now at the other studios, let's say at Fox Film, which existed up until 1935, as opposed to 20th Century Fox, which was after 35. Okay, at Fox Film, you had Frank Powalny, Eugene Cornman, who both started out kind of so-so and then developed into very skilled photographers. And um, there was a man who came in for a while named Hal Fife, who was a society photographer in New York, and his work was just kind of undistinguished. He didn't do well by Clara Bow, that's for sure. She needed Hurell, and it's a crying shame that he didn't get to do that session for her in fall of 32. Okay, then at Paramount, you had Eugene Robert Ritchie and Otto Dyer, who was from Europe. Ritchie was American, and he was a little bit older, and he adapted very readily to the new styles. But in his case, it wasn't so much switching from the soft light and the soft focus lens to hard light and a commercial lens. In his case, it was to observe the house style that Joseph von Sternberg, the movie director, had discovered on his own in his experiments with photographing Marlene Dietrich for the 7 films he did with her. And that technique consisted of spotlights with snoots on them to put a shadow on the forehead, a soft focus filter on the lens of the camera, or more often a cloth filter called marquisette that would put little stars around highlights. But it was definitely a soft look, but it's very different from the soft look of the soft focus lens, which was more like watercolor kind of an effect. This had a halos on things. And so Ritchie adapted to that style and maintained it up until the early 40s, when the whole department was sacked by a political thing, and so he was out the door, and he ended up as a still photographer, this unit still photographer at MGM. But Ritchie did very, very beautiful work of Dietrich and Veronica Lake, Carol Lombard, Gary Cooper, especially from McMurray. Okay, let's see. Now, Columbia, there was A.L. Schaefer, also known as Whitey Schaefer, and he took over when Ritchie was out the door at Paramount. Schaefer went over there, and he had a very recognizable style. He liked to have all these kind of Baroque gewgaws behind people, these big sculptural kind of things, look like meringue, and he used the same soft focus that Ritchie had used. So you get Betty Hutton in the 40s being photographed the same way as Dietrich was in the 30s, by Whitey Schaefer, who was a very nice man from what I heard. And very much beloved by his clients, subjects. But again, when you see the party pictures, he's not partying with the A stars. He's partying with supporting people and starlets and young people and his wife and his kids. Um, and let's see. So that's Columbia. Warner Brothers. There was Elmer Fryer, who was there from the mid-20s right up through the 38 when Hurell came in and Fryer was not pushed out, but he was pushed to the back. He was demoted. Um, and his work of all the majors is the most uneven and the most is kind a little on the pedestrian side at times. But let's see this one. Oh yeah, Scotty Welburn after Hurell left Warner's again in a state of high dudgeon. Welburn and Bert Six took over at Warner's in the 40s, and they both did some great work. Bert Six, in particular, of Vivian Lee for Streetcar Named Desire, some very, very powerful portraits. And that's about it.
Now, you've done so much extensive research into into that time and the photographic styles of the time. Are there any myths of the golden age that you've managed to sort of clarify?
Let me think. Well, there's Hurell, at a certain point, propagated myths because he was, I won't say ordered to, but he was told it was expedient to market him in 1980 when Cobell had laid the groundwork for this. But a savvy gallery owner named Alan Rich decided that he could make Hurell into something, give him a presence as gallery owners had done for people like Pierre Bonnard, the painters. Uh, so he created his whole Hurell myth, and one of the things was that Hurell had shot Greta Garbo and John Barrymore on Grand Hotel set. So here we had John Barrymore in the great profile and Greta Garbo, the great actress, and Hurell never shot that picture. I've done extensive research, and it was fairly easy, really, because I saw the negatives, the original negatives, and they all have dates on the edges of them. So Hurell couldn't have shot them. They were shot by somebody else. The question was who? Because it turns out Garbo didn't want him to photograph her. She had had enough of him after one session 2 years earlier on a film called Romance. She said, "No, I'm not gonna work with him." And if she said no, that was it. So, uh, he was doing all the other stars in Grand Hotel, the first all-star film, and so it came to time for her to be photographed with John Barrymore on the set in, it's called special art or poster art, and she said, "No, I'm not Hurell." So they brought a man in named Fred Archer, who had been at First National, which later became Warner Brothers, and was freelancing. Um, and they brought him in because he had a reputation as being a very well-known fine art photographer and was in salons, and he ran the Camera Club of California and the Camera Pictorialist Society. So he was very well known. So they brought him in to do, and he did the portraits of Barrymore and Garbo, but got no credit for it. Because if you look in the fan magazines of the period, Hurell's under all the other photograph, but there's nothing under that photograph. But Hurell went ahead and took credit for it, and all these galleries in the 1980s went along with the program. And my shameful part in this was that I sold him the little 8x10 print. It was a good quality print of that face-to-face profile picture, thinking that he would know what he shot, wouldn't he? No, yeah, he knew what he hadn't shot too. So that was it's sad when somebody sells out, but it
Where
happens.
where do you think that animosity between, Garbo and Hurell came from?
He was during sessions, his primary concern was that the subject not lose energy because you could see that in the eyes. When a person just was no longer there, that, "Oh god, I've had enough of this." The eyes were dead. So his way of coping with that was by being more theatrical than these actors were, by goofing off and singing and hollering, as he said, I was hollering a lot. Uh, Playing music, of course, definitely always playing music, and jumping around and making like a monkey and all this stuff. And Garbo just she didn't like being directed by a movie director, so she definitely would not like being directed by a still photographer. Clarence Bull or Ruth Harriet Louise didn't talk. They would play music, but they wouldn't talk. They would just let her assume a pose and they would get it, assume a pose and they would get it. But here he comes, directing her and doing all this stuff, and she said he's crazy, so she wouldn't work with him again.
What do you think, George Hurrell would make of portraiture or portrait photography in 2025 if he was still alive? If you could see, the Instagrams and all that kind of stuff, what do you think he would make of it? And digital technology and, everything else.
Well, I can tell you that both he and Clarence Bull said nasty things about strobe lights, first of all. Clarence Bull said to me, "Those speed lights," they were called speed lights at the time, "those speed lights are the worst thing that ever happened to photography." And yet he used them with great skill, but he preferred the incandescents. But in terms of the celebrity whole thing, oh, no, no. They they believed in the star system. They believed in this kind of idealized vision of human beings. So if you accept the idea that celebrity photography is essentially meant to tear down an image as opposed to build it up, uh, they would both reject it totally. I think they could shoot portraits, with a digital camera as I'm doing and make, to glamorize the people to in fact, I've done things with digital I could not do with, with a view camera because to change the shape of a chin or an ear, um, on a negative is very difficult. It's possible, but you've gotta use etching and pencil to do that, and you've gotta be very careful that it doesn't look what Cecil B. DeMille would call fakey. We don't want fakey. But to do that with digital, use the liquify tool.
Yeah, exactly.
So I've been able to really to do some very startling transformations, and yet I have to stop myself because you can't go too far. You can't change the basic contours of a human being's face because it's no longer them.
Yeah. It's, I mean, I often think, what people make of so the state of technology and the way that photography is being, what's the word? Um, the best way to describe it, I remember when I was looking at C.S. Bull's book when I was a kid, and I was really fascinated with that imagery because it was so, stylized and iconic, and it was like looking into a different world, you know. And I often feel that, when you're so like it's so oversaturated, when when you look at portraits on Instagram, for example, you're flooded with all these different impressions that none of those shots all of us have any meaning anymore because it's just thousands and thousands of images that you could consume in very little time. Um, that I very rarely come across something that I would describe as timeless. As we talked about earlier um,
Yeah, yeah.
in the conversation. Do you think? Can you think of any photographers th- that are active today, portrait photographers who do you think would have a similar kind of impact on photography that Hurell had?
Well, see, I use WeTransfer, just to send files. I guess everybody knows about WeTransfer, Dropbox, and they have all these, what would you call it, informal galleries of new photographers' work. It none of it qualifies as portraiture. So I mean, and then maybe I'm being unfair because maybe it's not supposed to be portraiture. But, to answer your question, I'm not sufficiently acquainted or cognizant of the current portraiture, you know, 2025 to make a a judgment. I will tell you one thing, though. When we talk about these gorgeous portraits and the prints that I saw in Dory Freeman's house the first time he opened the boxes of the stills he had stolen from MGM, uh, the shock was that pictures that were at that point 40 years old, they weren't yellowed.
Oh
The
wow!
black and white was perfect, and the black and white still is because they didn't use exhausted developers or I mean, well, no, stop that. It's fixture is the fixture was the culprit. When you get a picture that's yellow, it happens within 3 years because the fixture was exhausted. Anyway, what I was started to say was, if you look at the magazines, the same pictures in the magazines, in the portrait sections of Photoplay or Silver Screen or with any of those magazines, they don't look as good in those magazines as they do in the print because the magazines would airbrush them on
Right.
top of the retouching, and then you have a rotogravure which softened it further. So you just there were very few books at that time that could really give you the lithography that was truthful to the quality of an image of a print, I should say. You have a very clear print. You very, very seldom did you see a book at that time or magazine that got that, just what it was supposed to look like. Some of the foreign magazines, yeah, you did.
Any specific ones?
Cinegraph, which was from, I think, Argentina,
Oh, okay.
had beautiful lithography, really good. But that was the exception. I mean, the Hollywood magazines, all those American fan magazines, just the softer the better.
So how do you see your role as a historian um today?
Okay. The like that lady that used to go around, Carrie Nation would go to these bars and destroy bottles of liquor. So in my case, I'm going around destroying bad copies of beautiful pictures. That's what I started doing in the '70s was that, these little memorabilia shops had pilfered negatives from where they were in New York and were printing them and doing terrible prints, washed out, the bleached faces were blown out. Um, and I was trying to get, to a better version of that picture so that could be seen and not this terrible thing. So on my books, I tried to get well-known images that had been shown badly and to show the best possible version of them. So to that end, I've studied and worked and slaved at Photoshop. So, because what I don't do in the darkroom anymore, I'm not printing negatives, George Hurrell negatives in a darkroom anymore because there's no more. The negatives were all in the hands of private collectors, and they were all sold years ago at auction. Uh, so now I do the work digitally. So my role is to present these things as accurately as possible, the best quality image, and with the stories around them totally free of apocrypha.
And I have to say, I have the book here. Um, for anybody who's interested in getting a closer look at these phenomenal images, it's called George Hurrell's Hollywood. It's a fantastic book. It's amazing. The images are just mind blowing. Um, what's your next project? Do you have any new book projects lined up?
Yeah, I've been shopping a project about Joseph von Sternberg and the 7 films he did with Marlene Dietrich, and how he created his own still photography style in the course of creating a star whom he had discovered in Berlin, on the stage, and that's a fascinating story too. It's because it has the personal dimension as does the Hurrell story, his, fall from grace, his return from the ashes. Well, with Sternberg's case, it was a real obsession with this woman and how that obsession focused white hot on film and created fascinating movies, 7 movies. Each had his own world within it, and then also created a photographic style, the spotlight, the marquisate on the lens, the camera lens, exotic poses, and, um, just a fascinating, story. He was another true artist, you know, to his own detriment.
So when can we expect that book to hit the shelves?
Only God and the Vatican know for sure. I mean, I don't know.
Well,
The
please,
market is greatly changed
yeah, please let me know
since
when
the
it's out because I'd love to
yeah,
talk
since the
about it.
lockdown, everything changed in the publishing world.
Yeah. Um, lastly, what advice would you give any aspiring portrait photographer who would like to dive into the world of the golden age of Hollywood and create portraits like that? What would be your ultimate piece of advice?
Um, if possible, use incandescent lights. I mean, the rest you can figure out, the retouching and everything on your own, but use incandescent lights because you won't get those effects without them. And what every veteran I met in those, whether cinematographer or still photographer, study the old masters, Rembrandt, Caravaggio, Turner, um, um, Reynolds. It's all there.
There you go, and that brings us straight back to Hurell's fascination with painting. Mark, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Thank you so much for being the guest on the Camera Shake podcast this week.
Oh, thank you, Kirsten. Likewise.
All right, folks, that's a wrap for today's episode. Huge thanks to Mark for taking us deep into the world of classic Hollywood portraiture and sharing his extraordinary knowledge and plenty of stories. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't miss our other deep dives into portrait photography and photographic history. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting the podcast at buymeacoffee.com/camerashake. It truly helps us keep bringing incredible guests straight to your ears. And if you're tuning in via audio, don't forget there's a video version on YouTube in full Technicolor, as I say. Just search for Camera Shake Podcast to see the full experience over there. Thanks again for hanging out today. And remember, new episodes drop every Thursday. Mark that in your calendars. I want to say diaries, and I just mix it up with calendars. Never mind, calendars, diaries, whatever you kids use these days. Until next time, keep shaking things up. See you next week.